Hello Jason, it's Tuesday, June 3rd, and I'm really tired, so I'm going to try to make this as short as possible, and try to do it in as few takes as possible. Once again, today's video is going to revolve mostly around books, and it's not really my fault because the only challenge I seem to be making progress in is the reading challenge, so that's the only thing I have to talk about. The first book I want to talk about is one that I'm not really able to talk about yet, and that's 2001: A Space Odyssey, because I haven't watched the movie again yet, but it is definitely on my to-do list once I finally have some free time that I'm not using reading. In fact, you can't really see it, but it's right over there on my shelf somewhere, ready to be watched. Since my last video, I've been able to read two more books, the first of which is The Empire Striketh Back. When I first picked up the book, I knew that it was a William Shakespeare-style take on The Empire Strikes Back, but I didn't really know what to expect from it. There's definitely a lot of room for error in a project like that. And I have to say that after reading through it, I'm extremely pleasantly surprised. The attention to detail and the craftsmanship that went into it is really impressive. Most impressive. And what I really love about it, which I sort of alluded to in a previous video, is the way that it mashes together high and low culture. On one end of the spectrum, you have Shakespearean style, something that people consider the highest point in the English language. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have a sci-fi movie, not really the most prestigious genre in film. But by mashing them together, you're able to sort of comment on both of them and point things out which we don't necessarily think of in both those styles. You know, as I was reading through this book, I thought to myself, if I were an English professor teaching a course on postmodernism, this would probably be on the top of my syllabus. One interesting point though, in a previous video I mentioned that everyone was going to end up sounding like Yoda, and they did, but that's something that the author knew about from his experience in the first book. In fact, there's an entire section at the end of the book with the author explaining why he made certain characters sound the way that they do, and he talked about the fact that the most common comment he got after the first book was that it was going to be extremely difficult for him to do Yoda considering everyone in the first book sounded like Yoda. And so he knew that he had to come up with some unique way to explore the voice of this iconic character, and what he ended up doing was putting all of Yoda's lines in haiku. So now, coming down to the scores, for entertainment, I have to say the entire time I was extremely entertained. So I'm going to give it a 5 out of 5 for entertainment. My thumb's over here. And in terms of literary value, like I said, I was extremely pleasantly surprised. It's definitely almost close to being sort of near the quality of Shakespeare. So I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. So on the weekend, I'm going to go to the nearest chapters, which is in a town called Stratford, and try to find the first one so I can read it and get caught up. Interestingly enough, north of Woodstock, between here and Stratford, is a town called Shakespeare. The next book I finished was A Long Way Gone, the Memoirs of a Boy Soldier. And like I said before, I'm not really sure how much I want to talk about this book right away, but I will explain that it's the story of a boy soldier in Sierra Leone who, running away from rebels, ended up getting caught up in a war. He eventually ended up being rehabilitated and found his way to the United States, where he continued his education and eventually wrote this book. It's not really the type of book that you give a rating to, but I will say that I was sort of underwhelmed by it. Which is really weird to think about, because it's the story of a boy soldier. You shouldn't really be thinking that you're underwhelmed by it. But nonetheless, we live in a society which has conventions regarding these types of stories, and this book didn't fit those conventions, and so it didn't mesh with what I was expecting from it. Now, let me clarify that I don't want that to detract in any way from the story itself. It's definitely extremely important to hear about and understand these kinds of stories. But yeah, that's a weird thought. The fact that this story has become commercialized and an audience expects something from it. So once I finished that book, I wanted to move on rather quickly to something else, and my trend lately has been to try to find shorter books so that I can make up the difference between where I am now and where I should be regarding the challenge. So I looked over my bookshelf and I thought, which of these short books do I want to read? And absolutely nothing stood out to me. There were no books that I was really interested in, but one did catch my eye and I decided, why not go for it? So I'm now reading Under the Dome by Stephen King. Let me show you. It's like bigger than my head. This book has a total of 1,074 pages, so I don't really think I'll be finishing it in the next few days, but I am making progress through it rather quickly. I'm already on page 80, and I've only been reading it for like a couple of hours. As I'm sure you know from my previous experience with Stephen King, I find him extremely easy to read and really entertaining, so it does have that going for it. And now on to Battleship. Your last shot was a miss, and now you have an interesting choice ahead of you. You can go with your gut feeling that this ship will be vertical, or you can play with probability and shoot at one of the horizontal spots, hoping to hit there. As for my shot, I have pretty much the same probability regardless of whether I shoot horizontally or vertically, so I'm just going to shoot at H8